Welcome to Access Your Leadership, where we share inspiring career stories and talk about ways you can level up your own leadership potential. I'm your host and coach, Akeem Lokhtar, and today I'm back with my buddy, Al Kenny. If you remember, Al is a coach who works with people to help people achieve their goals and dreams without stress and pressure. He also hosts a podcast with his buddy, Mark Bilby, which I had the pleasure of being on. And I had Al on the podcast a few weeks back, and we were talking about his journey. But I was so interested in revisiting some of what we talked about that I insisted that Al be back on the show for a part two, and he graciously accepted. So, Al, thanks for being back here.
Thanks for having me back. The easiest invitation in the world to accept. It's like talking to one of my favorite humans. How could I possibly ever say no to that?
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So, what we were talking about at the end of the last podcast episode that we did together, and then it continued on after we hit pause on the recording, was this idea around the transformation that you were making as a leader. And if people go back and listen, I encourage you to listen to part one. I've already had a number of people share with me how powerful that episode was, and the phrase that you received from a person that you were interviewing, which was, Al is as likely to step over me if I'm needing help than he is to help me. That has been one that people have shared with me that has been an aha moment for them, wondering what would people say if they were to do a reference check on them as a leader. So I thought that was a great piece in that episode. But as we talked about the transformation and what that journey looked like, I realized that there was so much more meat to that, and wanted to come back and have the conversation around what that transformation was like, not only for you internally, but also for those around you as they were seeing Al Kenny, this big tough GM, now realize that there were some tweaks in his leadership style that he wanted to make to serve him and those that he led more effectively.
Yeah, no, it's like, by the way, I can't help but cringe when you hear that played back to you. So I'm glad it kind of resonated, but there's still a part of me that goes, oh man, what a dreadful thing for someone to have said about you. But it was a gift. It was a gift. I think just as you spoke that, I was like, that expression, I can't quite remember it, but what got us here won't get us there, popped into my mind. But what got us here did get us here. And that's what makes it hard to kind of shift, because you know what got you here, but you actually just don't know what's going to get you there. So the insight is a real gift. You go, oh wow, okay, like I know I want to change. But the journey, which, we were joking before we hit record, the long and winding road is one that I'm still on. It's not like there was no instantaneous shift in behavior and in actions, because I think the first thing I remember feeling was just confusion. And I think the word that we talked about was resistance. So what happened from there? I'm going to start with just something that someone reflected back to me. A lady that worked for me and is still a really good mate of mine. She's South African, based down in Australia now. She literally experienced me through the entire journey. And I sent her an email once, or I asked her, and she popped to me an email. I said, could you reflect back to me how it was to experience like me? Because she said, you're not the same person that you were then. And she described it as, she said, Al Mark 1, his way was the right way. And you either got on board with that or you didn't. And if you did, it was great. And if you didn't, it wasn't. And then she said, Al Mark II was like, hey, you know the way. But she said, but secretly, we all knew that you still had the like, but if you can't find it, like, I still have the way and we'll do it that way. And then she said, and Al Mark III was, there's no right way. And that probably sums up what I think is the hardest thing to let go of as a leader, and was for me. Like, the resistance was letting go of the idea that I know the right way. And even that there was a right way, and to see that the path, whatever that means, like for a group or for me, or that was going to emerge from a more relaxed place. And I still say that's probably the hardest thing that I have to deal with, is the idea of being patient and to let go of knowing, and to trust that things will work out if you give them space to work out. Um, and so I'm going to take a pause there, Hakeem, because that's what's just coming to mind for me right now is that that's the resistance that I felt. And I think it came from, I think the story I told in the last about, being the captain of the ship and it's my job to get the ship safely to harbor. That's really that I feel we're all conditioned to believe as leaders. Like your job is to get it from A to B. And the illusion is that you should know the route. And letting go of that, man, that is hard.
Yeah. I love the fact that you had somebody who could reflect back to you what their experience of you was to kind of presence you with what that journey was like a little bit. But I mean, it makes me think back to a conversation I had with a client recently. It was a pretty heated conversation where she was really doubling down on this idea that she's the leader of this team. When someone comes to her with a question, her job as a leader is to have the answer. The reason why I'm in this leadership role, I'm being paid to be in this leadership role. So my job is to have the answer. I have to have the solution. If I don't have the solution, then I shouldn't be in this leadership role. I mean, we went back and forth for a long while on this coaching call. And it was really just to get her around this idea. And I like the distinction, maybe we can talk about this, between there's no right answer or there's no wrong answer. Is there a difference there, do you think?
Well, I think there's a difference in terms of how we talk about, and I don't think there's a fundamental difference. I think we make decisions. This is how I think about it now, and I don't think I would have done had it been as clear about this in the past. We make decisions and they work out or they don't work out. And then we translate that into right and wrong. And therefore it looks like that there was an opportunity for us to have gotten it right.
Mm,
And therefore we try and get it right again. So no, I actually think right and wrong is not a very useful construct
yeah.
unless you're talking about maths,
Yeah.
like if I'm teaching Dylan, my 14-year-old, and I don't teach him maths anymore because 14-year-old maths at high school is far too complex for me. But when he was in primary school, 2 plus 2 does equal 4. And so in that kind of context of known knowns, there's like right and wrong.
Mm,
But when we're thinking about navigating anything to a point in the future, no, like there's no such thing as right and wrong. It's just
yeah.
people doing their best based on what they see to be true. And sometimes that will make sense to us and sometimes it won't. And that to me sits right at the heart of what we're talking about is everyone's doing their best based on what they see to be true. And that does not always make logical sense to everybody else. And so we can get lost in the maze of right, wrong, good, bad, all of that stuff. And I empathize with that client of yours because I can hear myself like that's my job and I've got to have the answer. What I would say, which was my experience, like that is the thing that keeps us trapped. That's where burnout lives. That is where suffering lives. Because if we create ourselves as having to have the answer, whoa, that's a heavy load,
It is.
for which there is no way to shed it without seeing through that
Yeah.
nasty little mirage.
Yeah. I had a guest on after you and I did the episode, and he had referenced your episode that he had listened to and really enjoyed, Dan Truex. And he was a 5 tour infantry Marine and had been in 5 rather challenging tours in the Middle East. And one of the things he was talking about was an AAR, which is the debrief that they have after a combat scenario. And he was sharing how he, as the team leader or the squad leader, platoon leader, would share his perspective, his evaluation of what happened, and then they'd go around, and every single person would have a different perspective based on where they were in that situation. And he said that was so eye opening to him because his experience was totally different. And they got to a resolution, we'll call it, not right or wrong, but they got to a resolution that allowed them all to then be there and to be debriefing on it. But if he were just wedded to this idea that what I saw or what I was seeing in that moment was the right thing, and nobody else could be right and everyone else was wrong, they wouldn't have been working as a team. They wouldn't have been the collaboration and the cooperation that they needed to get to the other side, quite literally. And I think it's so valuable for leaders. I hope anybody who's listening realizes that just because you're right, if we're using right and wrong just for distinction purposes, just because you're right doesn't mean that they're wrong. When I use this in my presentations, I talk about this. I have a little slide where it's the three planks of wood, and depending on which direction you look at them, there could be three, there could be four, and one's arguing no, it's three, and the other one's arguing no, it's four. It's like, well, just because you're right doesn't mean that they're wrong. When you go back and you think about the way in which you started to do this, you mentioned on the last episode that you were doing a lot of reading, a lot of researching, just a lot of learning about yourself, a lot about leadership. How did that then translate into you putting things into practice? You talked about even doing some, like you led some trainings too, or you led some sessions for your team or for colleagues. I can't remember exactly, but how did all of that then translate to you actually putting that stuff into practice and changing the way in which you led?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a really good question. I look back now, and I was lucky to meet. I think I mentioned Chris Shambrook was really influential for me. And the first thing that I got super interested in was like, how does performance work? Just what is performance, And because we were a high growth, super high growth tech company. And there was a lot of people under a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of stress in the organization all around that time I was talking about. And so I got really curious with Chris, like, what is performance? And we ended up running a whole series for the company of like master classes and coaching for performance and just getting into like, what's the difference between performance and results? And we had a very simple definition of performance, which came through from K2 was the company that Chris had, which was performance is doing the things you know to do to get the results that you want. And so probably the very first, that was the first meaningful shift in like, how do you set yourself up for performance? And we really started to educate people on not just technical and tactical, but like emotional and environmental and contextual. And for people to go, if you want to be really at your best, we've got to think beyond like the technical and tactical. And it's probably still it's much more commonplace now, I think. But back then there was a lot of amongst my leadership colleagues, there was a lot of skepticism when I was saying, we need to start thinking about people's physical and mental well-being and emotional well-being. And trying to figure out how to do that is not easy because that's not a one size fits all. But we even like we trained people. We had people trained to be performance coaches, and they weren't all leaders. And again, things that I learned about that, like I probably was like, I've got it, we've figured this out. Like we all just need to do this. And I tried to get everyone through it. And some people just thought it was like mumbo jumbo. And I saw again that even there I was still falling into the trap of like, we found the answer.
Mm,
But it started to shift for lots of people. Like I know there are people that went through that, and me included, that started to go, oh, that's so interesting. And for example, one of the things we did, we turned an entire wall in the sales part of the building into what we called a performance wall. And it wasn't perfect, but the way in lots of go-to-market organizations, the results are all on show. Like that's the thing. And we just tipped the whole emphasis on performance. And we're like, let's look at where we're at in performance, because if we're green on performance and the result is red, then there's not more that we can do because like we're
mm.
performing. So maybe that was the best that we could do. Or maybe now we have to look at, right, well, what is it that we're doing within that? And it just led to more nuanced conversations. And it's I think about because there's something in my mind for what I found challenging as well, or what I do think is challenging in leadership. Actually, holding your space of not having the answer in one sense is even more challenging. It's as challenging in different ways than putting it all on your shoulders. Because if you're an experienced leader, and depending on the people who are in your team, like oftentimes, there are going to be people that maybe are going to be less experienced and stuff. So in some ways, you kind of will have the answer, but just holding that space for people and really being like, you've got this. And that's probably was the first part of just saying, the shift in me was like, I've got this, was holding the space of like, you've got this. So I'm not going to give you the answer. And starting to just create that conversation and just to take some of the emphasis off results was probably the first key part that I think we introduced. And that probably set the ball rolling downhill. And then some things that we tried, like I tried lots of different things. So we tried to bring in a performance director. I ultimately, I actually just think I made a bad hire, which meant that good idea, bad hire meant it was a bad idea. But the bit that I was just going to say as well, this kind of led me to it, is I think about this like a pendulum now. If there was, back when that person said that about me, the pendulum was all over here and like driving hard and not really caring who I upset along the way. What happened was that in one sense, the pendulum swung too far the other way
Mm.
next, which was also a challenge for me, was like, and probably resulted in one of my biggest failures now that I think about it. Like I ended up getting the role of chief revenue officer for that company, not for a huge length of time. Well, I don't know, but it didn't work out. And I look back now and it didn't work out because I was just trying to be too collegiate. It was like trying to get the answer from the room, like almost by committee. And I
Mm.
never really, I'd gone too far away from like, no, your job is still to kind of plot the course. You've still got to lead and you've got to be prepared to, yes, use your eyes and use your ears and see what other people see and hear what they're saying and then call the ball. And there's a fine balancing act. And what happened was I got this amazing opportunity and it didn't work out because I just never really made it mine. I was almost too fearful then of going, oh well, no, like you gotta make everyone feel included and you've gotta, it's gotta feel like it's everyone's decision. And I would say that that's almost equally as unhealthy as the
Yeah.
other way because they're just extreme positions. And it's like, no, the balance of leadership is to, as I see it now, is to slow down, to listen, and then know the space. You're like, hey, I'm I'm setting the direction. And that is a huge opportunity. And one that I learned coming off the back of that, because, actually, I was lucky to have a very supportive CEO in Peter Bauer. And no doubt he would have been under pressure to kind of, because the obvious answer when it doesn't work out for you as CRO is not that you stay in the company, it's often that you leave.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen. And so the next time that I ended up in that, and we kind of hit the stagnant point in my region at that time. And I had a brilliant mentor, a guy called Bob Elliott. And he and I were, and I was like, I just don't know what's going wrong. Because like we'd been on this incredible run. Like I'd taken my medicine and thought, okay, like that's not going to be the final chapter in that story. And
Mm.
got the European region, which was predominantly UK at the time, flying and built an amazing team, a team I'm incredibly proud of. Proud of all my teams. I look back on this one as been like one of those just some really cool moments in that. And then suddenly we stagnated. And I mean, we went from, it's like felt like a Ferrari, and then all of a sudden it was like going Lada speeds. Lada, I don't know if a Lada cars familiar in America, but it was like I think it was a Russian car that was not very good that was in Europe 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago even. And I was with Bob and I was like, I just don't get it. Same people. And he just said to me, he's like, where does the future come from? I said, man, like, where does the future come from? And I threw a couple of things out and that clearly wasn't the right answer. I said, Bob, like, just tell me. He said, the future comes from your words. He said, my question to you is, have you spoken a big enough future into the minds of your team?
Mm.
He's like, because what I think has happened is you created a box for them 18 months ago and you plotted the course. Like, we're going here and I don't know how we're going to get there, but that's where we're going and we're just going to make it happen. And they were amazing and we all grew into it and it was like a shared vision. And he said, they've just grown into the box. So they've stopped. And your job is to now create a bigger box for them to grow into. It's like, oh. And
Yeah.
there's the balance, like between I don't know the way and I don't know the answer, and there is no right way. And my job is still to create a big enough space and opportunity for us all to be able, like, whoa, so that's where we're going, like that mountain.
Yeah.
Um, and that is now, I think, kind of in my coaching and where I'm at now, that's my favorite part of what I do, which is like, oh, like that is it. And then being in conversation with people, which is like, no, the answer's here. We will find it. It's in you, or it's in me, it's in us.
Yeah, being able to create a vision like that, as you're talking about it, that people can really buy into and sink their teeth into is so important. And I think, especially in the context when I work with this company out of the UK, the Training Rock, one of the things we define as the primary responsibility of leaders is to develop their people. Short and sweet. Your role as a leader is to develop your people. Now you have your job too. There's job descriptions and duties and responsibilities in your job description, like, which is what you're alluding to. There's also your role as the leader to execute on certain things in your role that you have to do. But in order to get there, especially if you're leading others, if you are focused and your responsibility is developing your people, opening that box or expanding that box or creating that vision or whatever it might be, supporting them individually, supporting them as a team, creating access to resources, on, is all in service of developing them. Because if they've reached your 18-month mark successfully and you're just like, okay, cool, we've reached that, congratulations, everybody, and then you just stagnate, like you said, nobody's growing. You've plateaued. Nobody's taking themselves or the company or your results to the next level. So if you can keep it in this sort of like very vague, my job as a leader is to develop my people. And I remember in every leadership role I had, if I had, that was front and center for me. And people used to comment on, you spend a lot of time developing your staff. I said, it's my job. It's my job is to develop them. And of course, I did my things. I had my own responsibilities. I was building 3 websites and building a publication that I had never done before. I mean, I can think of all the things that I was busily in my office doing. And I also knew that if my staff needed me, if my team needed me, if there's an opportunity to give them growth, development, that was going to serve us as an organization so much more. And I'm curious, how did everyone receive when talking about the pendulum swing? And I mean, I can picture that overcorrection. And I want to go back to that just quickly, just to say to anyone who's listening, it's a very natural thing to have occur. That overcorrection for being a certain way or leading in a certain style. People catch themselves, they say, okay, I noticed. Now let me correct for that. And then they go the complete opposite extreme because they think, well, if this is wrong, then the opposite must be right. And I think that's the right and wrong. Let's just throw that out and actually focus much more on the way in which I can lead authentically, the way in which I can develop my people. As you started to realize that and you centered yourself a bit more, how were you as this new leader, Al, received by people? I mean, they knew you as that at one time, and then now you're overcorrecting, and now you've gotten yourself back into, this more balanced state. How did people respond to that?
I know. I don't like it's the honest answer. Like it would probably have to be someone here. Overall, I think people appreciated the journey because I do think it was obvious that I became, when I think I said the last day that Peter used to describe me as tough love, but you had to look hard for the love. But I do genuinely believe it was always there. Like I don't believe that I was uncaring at the heart of it. So I would imagine, and I think it's probably true, but I'm probably been a little bit self-conscious. I think people appreciated it for the most part, and for the most part rose up to meet it. Because like it wasn't because I didn't really become a soft cuddly bear. Like I think even when I think the pendulum swung too far the other way, I still think I probably commanded more, had more presence, and had more like just of that, still that kind of natural, if that's the right word, way of being in terms of like leadership and man, like it's just something that's always felt reasonably natural. Um, the bit that I was just drawn to say was about that. I think people saw it as like almost me becoming, you know, more rounded. And that what gets you here won't get you there. There's a really truth in that, but what you got you here will still be part of getting you there. Like that's
Mm,
probably been my biggest learn. I used to think that I was bad back then. And I'm like, no, you weren't. Like, you're great. And I genuinely look back at that guy and go, I'm so grateful to him. He was freaking awesome in all his bluntness and his roughness and ignorance, just because he didn't know better. He was freaking awesome. And like this guy wouldn't be sat here without him. So like I'm very grateful to past me. And as time's gone on, I think I see it now all as like being able to kind of just go, I'm still that. Like, and and I've just added more to it, become more round. I've seen more. My grounding's deeper, and that pendulum swing. I think that as we move along over time and we start to really invest, and I do think that like if anyone like for the listener, I I think I've invested really heavily in trying to go in and understand me and how I work. And that is the greatest way to understand how anyone works in many ways is to kind of know that you are patient zero in your world.
yeah.
Only always. Like your patient zero, go to yourself. It's always you. And the more you can figure out about yourself, the easier it will be to understand others. And as I've done that, that pendulum, I can see the pendulum a bit better now. I have a feel for the pendulum.
Mm,
It's like, I'm worrying too much about hurting Hakeem's feelings here, and I'm not speaking my truth. Speak your truth. You're
mm,
good. And even if you crack an egg, it's fine. Like,
mm.
we'll either make an omelet or we'll make a cake that might not taste great, but we'll just make another cake. Like,
Yeah.
and so you start to get a feel for it and you start to really trust it and you come back to your value set. You come back to your yeah, no, I care about this person in front of me. I care about what we're up to. And I'm going to trust myself and go with what I feel right. And if that is to push, I'm going to push. And if that's to hold, I'm going to hold. But I'm not going to be driven by the idea that uptightness, I've got to get somewhere. I think the greatest gift that I've been given through so many mentors and different things is to appreciate just be in the moment, trust yourself, feel for the pendulum, and just find the place that feels right and go with that. And that's a probably a very long winding answer to a question that I'm not even sure that you asked, but it's kind of
No,
where I ended
I
up
think
going.
there's so much in that, and I think if for anyone who's listening, what I took away from that, which is such an important thing to remember when we're on any journey of self-actualization, self-improvement, self-leadership, is this piece of once we recognize something that's not serving us in the way that we wish that it would or would love for it to, it's not to abandon it. It's not to shame it. It's not to cut it off or lance it. It's this idea that it's a part of you and that it exists and that at some point in time it was there because you did need it. And I
Mm.
think that the way in which you celebrate that version of you, that's why I asked the question originally, how were you received as they watched your transformation? Talk about leading by example. This wasn't the expectation that I'm doing this, now you now have to read the same book I'm reading or attend the same course I'm attending. This is my journey. I'm owning it. I'm loving it. I'm loving what was, I'm loving what is now. And I think if people can see that, and this is for leaders who are, and I've had clients say this, I don't know if people are going to like that version of me, or they're so used to me this way. I'm not sure if they would respond well to me being a different way. And I say, this is your journey. This is for you to embark on, for you to reflect on, for you to notice, and for you to enjoy. And I think that it's easy for people to get wrapped up in the judgments of what was right or what was wrong or good or bad versions of themselves. It's not about that. It's about continuing to move forward. And most often, and I'm glad that was the case in your experience, most often when people see you doing that, bettering yourself, becoming more well-rounded, people then take notice and they start to respect your journey and then decide to venture onto their own journey if they so choose. But there's a level of understanding, a level of connection, a level of respect that I think that just sort of inadvertently creates because you're owning it. You're not doing it to influence others necessarily. You're doing it because you realize that this is going to serve you in a better way in this new season of your life or in this new role. And that's all okay. So I'm mindful of time. I know I got to let you get going, but this has been so helpful as you think about the way that people are experiencing their own journey and wondering if this is going to be something that happens overnight, if it's going to be something that people are going to have a reaction to, positive or negative in their mind, based on the story that they're creating. And hearing you share what that was like for you and the way that you went about it. And again, just the pendulum swinging, that example and that visual helps people presence themselves to this idea that there's going to be that pendulum swinging one way and the other way constantly. And to notice that and to become more attuned to that in yourself then allows you to more effectively respond to these leadership challenges or tasks or responsibilities that you might face versus having to reinvent who you are as a leader every day. And we've talked about that before. But any final thoughts before I give you a chance to remind people where they can get in touch with you and how to connect with you?
Oh, I just think, and it probably comes back to our right and wrong. Like the one thing I love to say, and I'll say it here, it's like you can't get it wrong. And the favorite way I like to talk with this now is if anyone knows like Hang Tough from Gladiators, and the people that really struggle with that game are trying to get it right and they just lose momentum. And when you know you can't get it wrong, you realize it's more about the swing and less about the rope. And so I just say to people, like, you can't get it wrong. Just go for it, go for what feels right. And that is probably, if you were to ask me to sum up what's my biggest lesson when I was just reflecting on this, and I really appreciate being on here twice in conversation with you. It's been so much fun to actually just go back in and have someone ask and some great questions and be in conversation around it is like, oh yeah, I couldn't have got it wrong. You know, you just swing and you just swing again as best you can. And someday you get to sit down with a mate and reflect and be like, bloody hell, that was a pretty cool journey. All of it.
Yeah, that's a great place to end it. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, just for those who maybe didn't pick up on it the last time, how can people reach out to you? How can people learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, you can go to my website, alkenny.org. I'm on LinkedIn, Al Kenny Coaching on Instagram, or drop me an email to al@alkenny.org. I just decided to get Al Kenny into as many things as I possibly
I
could
love
and
it.
make it
Yeah.
easy.
Just burn it into your brain. Al Kenny, Al Kenny. Love it. Well, thank you again for taking the time. I feel like we could do part 3, 4, 5. I mean, it's a conversation that you and I will continue having. I know that for sure. But hopefully, the listeners, I'm sure they did, got so much out of part 1 and part 2 of this. Thank you for taking the time to share your story and your journey and what this has led you to create in your own life and your own coaching for yourself, for your family, for your clients. I always appreciate our time together, Al. Thanks so much.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for having me on.
As always, I'd love to hear from you about the episode. What came up for you as you think about leveling up your leadership game? And please, if you enjoyed the episode, I encourage you to like and subscribe. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn at Hakeem A. Lakhdar or at lakhdarcoaching.com. Thanks for tuning in. Keep being great, and we'll see you next time.